Hi, everyone. So the topic of this presentation really is augmented reality. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the way in which we deal with augmented reality and similar technologies in education. And what I'm going to be suggesting in the presentation is that there's an opportunity for us to deal with technologies such as augmented reality from perspectives other than a simply instrumentalist perspective. So that's really the main topic of the discussion today. And I'm going to begin essentially with a quotation from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding, because I think it expresses to some extent the journey that I am suggesting teachers and students can undertake in terms of grappling with technology and the relationships between technology, humanity, and the environment. Simply, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So we'll be coming back to that a little bit later in the presentation. So perhaps what I should do is outline more broadly what I see to be the problem. So from an educational perspective and from the perspective of integrating technologies into the curriculum, whether that be at secondary, primary level, or whether it be at tertiary level, we face a very similar sort of challenge. So the approach generally, and I suppose more widespread, is that technologies, quite rightly, are perceived as tools for learning. But what follows from that probably is slightly more problematic. And that is generally the assumption that when we deal with technologies for learning, we're essentially dealing with objects in the world. So objects that can be manipulated, can be implemented. And so what you see really is viewing technologies from the perspective of use, from an instrumentalist perspective, if you like. But what we don't often do is examine the relationships between humanity, technology, and the environment, for instance. So we often view technologies from an instrumentalist perspective rather than from a relational perspective. And that, in a sense, is problematic because what it does is provide us with a fairly narrow view of the way in which technologies function in particular contexts, and more specifically in education. So it's really a matter of this particular presentation addressing ways in which we can make either teachers or we can make students aware of the implications of the interaction between technology and society, and for the purposes of this presentation, more specifically, the relationship between technology, humanity, and the environment. And what I'm going to do during the presentation is I'm going to use augmented reality as an example to demonstrate some of the things that I'm suggesting. So that in broad is the problem that I'd like to address in the ensuing slides. So a good place to begin always, I suppose, is a definition. And so if we think about defining augmented reality, the Oxford Online Dictionary defines it quite simply as a technology that superimposes a computer-generated image on a user's view of the real world, thus providing a composite view. So that's a very broad definition provided by Oxford Online Dictionaries. But if you look at much of what's been written in the literature, you will find definitions that are fairly similar, and they seem to encompass the elements included in the second bullet point. Essentially, the idea that augmented reality, or AR, provides an overlay of computer-generated content on a view of the real environment for the purposes of enhancing human capability. So there are two really important aspects to that definition. The one is the idea that there is some form of computer-generated content, and the other part of the definition that's important is that this computer-generated content is in fact overlaid on a user's view of the real world. And so we'd like to examine some of those aspects of the definition in a little bit more detail. So the questions we're going to use to direct our discussion over the next number of slides are the following three questions. Well, first of all, what makes a real environment real? What do we mean by real, in fact? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the substantive difference between a real environment and an overlay? Because if you look at the definition, then you'll realize very quickly that there's a clear separation of real environment and overlay. They're not seen as being similar or the same, they're seen as being substantively different. And then finally, we could ask the question, when we think about augmentation, who or what is being augmented? And quite often, the answer to that question might not be as simple as one might imagine. So let's begin by examining in a little bit of detail the relationship between technology and the environment. So in order to demonstrate the point that I'm making with regard to technology and environment, what I'm going to do initially is I'm going to compare a definition of augmentation, of augmented reality, with a definition of ubiquitous computing, or UbiComp. So as we've said, augmented reality sees or is defined essentially as the overlay of digital information on a user's view of the world. In contrast, ubiquitous computing, as defined by Mark Weiser, 1991 originally, envisions the embedding of computing in the natural environment. And here's the really important bit in Mark Weiser's own words, such that these technologies weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. Now, an interesting question to ask here is, if you look at those two definitions, as best as we can define it, where would we see the site of computation being? Well, in the terms of augmented reality, what you have is you have an intermediary interface, in a sense, which mediates between the user and the real world. And so in a sense, the computation, I suppose in a very broad sense really, the site of computation there is the intermediary interface. But if you look at ubiquitous computing, the site of computation there is very different. The site of computation is really the real environment itself, because in a sense, what happens is you have technology infusing the so-called real environment, and therefore becoming part and parcel of that environment. And so in a sense, the site of computation in ubiquitous computing is the real environment itself. And this leads people to formulate concepts such as, for example, the concept of everywhere. So if you think of the Internet of Things, for example, Greenfield has argued that in the kind of world that results from the Internet of Things and the implementation of that, it represents nothing less than the colonization of everyday life by information technology. So the idea that virtually the whole environment becomes, in a sense, aware, right? And that has all sorts of applications. If the real environment is infused with technology, and if in a sense it becomes aware, what are the implications of the relationship between humanity and technology in that kind of environment, where, you know, as Weiser and Brown and others have said, just the mere fact of walking into a room has consequences, because you don't know, you know, what's being recorded, what's not being recorded, what's being done with that recording, etc., etc., etc. So what's the point of this comparison? Well, the point of this comparison is partially to challenge the concept that there is a substantive difference between a digital overlay and the real world. So if we take as given the definition of ubiquitous computing provided by Mark Weiser, then essentially, if you think about augmented reality in that kind of situation, what you have is you have the overlay of digital information onto a essentially digitally infused environment. And so one of the questions we asked earlier was, what makes the real environment real? Well, according to ubiquitous computing and that sort of view of the world, you could argue that what makes the modern day real environment real is that it's infused with technology. And so essentially what augmented reality is doing in that kind of environment is overlaying digital information upon digital information, in a sense. So the sort of substantive difference between digital overlay and real world, the definition of augmented reality, is something that is open to debate, very definitely. So that's the relationship between technology and the environment. Let's have a look now at the relationship between technology and humanity, and we'll pick up on one or two specific points that have been made in sort of some of the seminal pieces of work of the last number of years. So we can go all the way back now to Marshall McLuhan's work in the 1960s and Engelbart's work in the 1960s as well. So if we look at McLuhan first, the vision that he presents in Understanding Media is a vision of media, as he called it, and by extension technology, as an extension of the human body. And so he would argue, for example, that the motor car would be an extension of the legs and the feet because it provides us with the ability to travel over longer distances. And so, of course, there's not time here necessarily to cover the full ramifications of this argument. But if we accept the premise that media and technology, more specifically, provides us with the ability, for example, to extend our understanding, our knowledge, and so forth, and our learning via various networks, amongst others, the World Wide Web, then we could see how such an extension provides absolutely wonderful advantages to humanity. But what's quite interesting is McLuhan's suggestion that the logical conclusion of this extension of the human body is essentially that we'll translate ourselves into the form of information and the technological extensions of consciousness. Bear in mind that this was written in 1964, before something like the World Wide Web existed. And so when you read that logical conclusion that McLuhan draws, you are almost immediately drawn to the concept of the way in which modern day artificial intelligence is looking for mechanisms, in a way, for translating humanity into forms of technology. So what's actually happening in modern day life was predicted a whole number of years ago. So what this represents, more to the point for our discussion, is rather than the colonization of the environment by technology, what we have here, interestingly enough, in a sense, is the colonization of technology by humanity, which is a really interesting perspective. So another perspective provided on the relationship between technology and humanity is provided by Engelbart, 1962. Humans and their means of augmentation constitute a system, and this system is a useful field of inquiry into human intellectual effectiveness. So in examining the concept of humanity and its system of augmentation, what Engelbart essentially argues is that the proper unit of study is the system itself, and so therefore not only humanity, but also humanity and its forms of augmentation in the form of artifacts, language, methodology, training. What's quite interesting is under artifacts, Engelbart actually includes computational devices and their use and the way in which they interact. So in fact, what Engelbart is arguing is that forms of augmentation are, in fact, substantively part of what we call the human intellect system, if you like. And so what Engelbart is saying is something similar to what McLuhan's saying, although not exactly the same, namely the idea that when we speak about human intellect as a system, we have to include humanity's means of augmentation. They make out part of the system of human intellect. And so, just as McLuhan suggests that we translate ourselves into information and into technological extensions of consciousness, so Engelbart suggests that we can't really think about human intellect unless we include those augmentation mechanisms that are part of the human intellect system. And so once again, what he's suggesting here is almost, if you like, the colonization of technology by humanity, which is a really interesting perspective. Right, so let's take this argument one step further. So Stiegler, writing in 1998 in Techniques and Time, Part 1 more specifically, considers the concept of techniques as incorporating both the history of organized inorganic matter, so the creation of tools, instruments, machines, but also the techniques and the knowledge and practices associated with the creation and effective use of those objects. So when he speaks about techniques, what he's really speaking about to some extent is a bit of a throwback to the 1960s writings, in the sense that it's very, very difficult to think of technology as being separate from the way in which it's used and the knowledge of surrounding that, the techniques surrounding that. So what Stiegler argues is that if you think about the way in which technology exists in the world, you by definition also have to think about the way in which it interacts with humanity and the way in which humanity interacts with technology. And so he refers to that interaction as an inherently complex, mutually constitutive process. A process he calls a process of grammatization. And so what this suggests, very interestingly, is that when you think about modern day definitions of humanity and technology, then inherently you can't actually separate them. The two become inseparable. And in a sense, I suppose, if we had to try to summarize his perspective on this, it's captured in that phrase, mutually constitutive process. Because just as humanity is consistently evolving, so also techniques and technology consistently evolve. But the important point is that the two evolve together in an intertwined, interpenetrating fashion in such a way that it's almost impossible to separate them. So what relevance does this have for our definition of augmented reality? Well, it makes the definition really difficult to actually, shall we say, stick to in any meaningful sort of way, because in effect, processes of grammatization render augmented reality pretty much an impossibility. Because if you think about it from Stiegler's perspective, and to some extent from McLuhan's and from Engelbart's perspectives, this intertwining, if you like, or interpenetrating or mutually constitutive nature of the real world and humanity and technology, then what becomes very clear is that it's quite difficult to see them as substantively different things. And because they're not substantively different things, because in fact they constitute one fabric, then that sort of renders our traditional definition of augmented reality as irrelevant, as unimportant, as not possible. It's an impossibility in essence. Right, so yeah, once again, if we think about the definition of augmented reality with which we began, and we think about the nature of the real world versus the digital overlay, you'll see that both from the perspective of the relationship between technology and environment and the relationship between technology and humanity, that definition becomes, if not very seriously open to question, then untenable, possibly, in terms of these insights. Right. So let's examine this a little bit further. So if we think about media and we think about technology, let's now broaden the perspective slightly and think about the relationship between technology and reality from the perspective of this particular argument. Well, an interesting perspective on the whole relationship, if you like, between media, technology on the one hand, and between reality on the other is presented by Baudrillard, 1988, where he was considering more specifically the media environment and what he called the abstractions or models in the media environment. And his argument was quite simply this, that if you look at the models or abstractions in the modern media environment, they actually have no correlative original or reality, if you like. And in a sense, the metaphor that he uses is the idea that the map precedes the territory. And so he speaks about the precession of simulacra, or the idea that copies precede anything related to an original or real. So what he's arguing essentially is something that's quite familiar to us in modern day, in our modern day media environment. For example, when we think about concepts such as alternate facts or fake news, or you think about the plethora of different views that are presented on any conceivable topic on the internet nowadays, then it becomes very hard to think of those particular artifacts, media artifacts, as having some kind of original correlative, a real correlative, if you like. They're unanchored in a way. And in a sense, I suppose that's what makes it so difficult, really, for most people to ascertain what constitutes fact in a media environment. In fact, Baudrillard would argue that there is no such thing as a correlative fact in an environment like that. So another example that he provides is the example of Disneyland. And his argument, quite simply, is this, that when you look at artifacts in the media, they are simulacra, simulations, and not very good ones at that. But more importantly, what happens with those particular simulacra is that because they don't have an original correlative or a correlative in reality, what happens is they are entangled with further levels of simulation. And so in a sense, it becomes the age-old problem of turtles all the way down in Greek philosophy. So in terms of the Disneyland example, he says the first order of simulation is fairly obvious, and that exists in the imaginary worlds presented to visitors in the form of the various theme parks themselves in Disneyland. So that's a first order of simulation. But that first order of simulation is entangled in a second order of simulation. And his argument is that's represented in the sort of inherent warmth and affection of the crowd and the celebration in Disneyland of the real America in a way. And you can see how that's very clearly a simulation in the context of Disneyland. So that, he says, is a second order entangled of simulation. A third order of entangled simulation, he says, is the presentation of Disneyland as imaginary and designed, if you like, to be contrasted with the real America of Los Angeles and so forth, the rest of America. And his argument is that labeling Los Angeles and the rest of America as real is not actually true at all. It's a false representation of reality, in a sense. And so what his argument essentially is that by setting up Disneyland as a simulation of the real America, it actually obscures or hides the fact that there is no correlative real America, in a sense. That what we refer to as the real America or the real Los Angeles is itself a form of simulation. And so what the setting up does of Disneyland versus the real America is it preserves what he calls the reality principle, rather than actually having a correlative in reality or a correlative origin. So this is an interesting perspective when we think about media and we think about technology, the extent to which, the artifacts that we see in the media have some sort form of correlative in reality or not. And his argument certainly would be that they don't. Quite often they are simulations that precede any concept of an original or real. So what does this mean for our augmentation situation, and more specifically augmented reality as we've been thinking about it? Well, one thing to sort of consider in the light of this particular argument is, the reality, or no, that's perhaps a bad way of putting it, the unthinkableness, the culturally unthinkable of being able to suggest that you are able to take a real environment and you're able to overlay that with digital information. It becomes, in a sense, an impossibility for the very simple reason that there is no real correlative or original, actually. in conclusion, I'll come back to what I said at the beginning, namely the idea that if we want teachers and students to be able to grapple with technology meaningfully, what we need to do is move beyond a purely sort of instrumentalist approach where we're showing them how to actually use a technology for educational purposes. Certainly, that's necessary. That's something we do. But to fully understand the way in which technology and humanity and the environment are intertwined, we need to be able to engage with teachers and students around those relationships. In other words, what I'm suggesting, I suppose, is not only an instrumentalist approach, because that has its value to some extent, but also, and in some ways more importantly, particularly in the world of AI and AI ethics, is a relational approach where we examine the relationships between technology, humanity, and society. And if we can do that, then coming back to the quotation from T.S. Eliot at the beginning, I think what we will have done is we will have enabled people to work with augmented reality from a vastly expanded perspective. And in Eliot's terms, they'll come back to where they started in terms of their use of augmented reality, but with a totally different perspective on the way in which it operates in society more generally. Thank you.